When the weather can't make up its mind, we can help you make up yours. Check on BBC Weather.
Hello there, live from London. This is BBC News. India's Foreign Secretary accuses Pakistan of provocative and escalatory actions following claims by Pakistan that an Indian airbase and airfield were destroyed by missiles. It comes after Indian strikes on Pakistan as tensions rise between the new nuclear neighbours over the disputed region of Kashmir. In other news, Sir Keir Starmer is in Ukraine as calls for Russia to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire intensify. Police are investigating after one of Britain's worst killers allegedly attacks a guard in one of the UK's most secure prisons. And part of a Soviet spacecraft in orbit for more than 50 years is expected to crash back to Earth on Saturday. But where will it land? Nobody knows. Hello there, I'm Rich Preston. Welcome to the programme. Let's begin in South Asia, and Pakistan says it's retaliating after accusing India of striking 3 of its air bases overnight, including one close to the capital, Islamabad. Both countries blame each other for the violence since militants killed Indian tourists last month in Indian-administered Kashmir. Pakistan denies any involvement. At least 50 people have been killed since the fighting escalated on Wednesday. The G7 group of the world's top industrial nations has called for an immediate de-escalation and direct dialogue between the two countries. The Indian military gave an update on their operation at a news conference earlier.
In a swift and calibrated response, Indian armed forces carried out precision attacks only on identified military targets. These included technical infrastructure, command and control centers, radar sites and weapon storage areas. Pakistan military targets at Rafiqi, Murid, Chaklala, Rahim Yar Khan, Sukur and Chunya were engaged using air-launched precision weapons from our fighter aircraft. Radar sites at Pasroor and Sialkot Aviation Base were also targeted using precision munitions. While carrying out these responses, India ensured minimum collateral damage.
Well, let's go straight to Delhi and our correspondent Anbarasan Etirajan. Anbarasan, this is a fast-moving story. Claim, counter-claim, strike, counter-strike. What can you tell us?
Well, the situation changed dramatically early in the morning when Pakistan announced that it had carried out missile strikes on selected Indian military bases in the northern part and northwestern part in Punjab province as well as in Indian-administered Kashmir. That really escalated the situation. It became a conflict. And hours later, the Indian Foreign Ministry held a press conference where they said they were responding to the Pakistani attacks and they had targeted specific military bases inside Pakistan. Now, we have a situation where both sides were using high-speed missiles. So that is a dangerous escalation because the two countries have not been here in this situation before, even though they had wars over Kashmir in the past. Since gaining independence from Britain in 1947, we saw the drone warfare for the past 3 days and then followed by this very intense missile strikes where people in Srinagar are talking about loud explosions, and in Jammu overnight in the northern part in India, and the same in Rawalpindi and in other places in Pakistan where people were talking about explosions overnight. So it was a very dangerous prospect of this turning into a more intense conflict. But following this, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio had phone calls with the leaders of both countries in India and Pakistan and asked them to de-escalate, otherwise it will end up in miscalculation. So as you know, you can start a conflict, but no one knows how this will end. So any wrong step by one party can escalate the situation. The messages we are now getting is like what India is saying: if Pakistan shows intent to de-escalate, we are ready. At the same time, the Pakistan leaders are also saying if India doesn't attack anymore, then we can de-escalate. So that is the latest situation here now.
Well, and Barasan, we have heard that from both sides, each saying we are willing to de-escalate. Those calls from the US and the G7 urging de-escalation. But that sounds like lip service. It doesn't, we hear these words and then we hear about missile strikes. It doesn't actually sound like either side wants to de-escalate.
Well, if you go by the statements in the past few days, yes, you're right. They were talking about de-escalation, but then really the missiles and then the drones were flying across the border. But the situation here now is more intense, and they had not seen this before, and it is a territory where they have not been in before because of this use of high-tech weapons using very powerful military jets. And the passions are running high. It's not about, because both of them were slowly walking into this very high intense conflict situation, because one leading to another. So if there is any specific military objective on either side, then you can predict where this will end. Is there any objective? But the goalposts seem to be changing for both sides, what they want to do, because Pakistan has always been talking about we have to retaliate at a time and place of our choosing, and India was saying our measures have been, very calibrated measures against what they call terrorist infrastructure inside Pakistan. But then the drones and then the missiles continued, and let us see whether they can stand up to the words now, and whether US has got more influence in these two countries to bring the situation under control.
Okay, Barasan Etirajan for us in Delhi. And Barasan, as always, thank you. Let's go live now to Pakistan and our correspondent there, Azadeh Mashiri. Azadeh, precision strikes targeting terrorist infrastructure, according to the Indian government. What's the view from Pakistan?
Pakistan denies that there are any terrorist camps or training centres here in the country, and so they would refute what India is saying there. And the message that keeps coming out of the military as well as the government, the civilian government, is that everything they're doing is a retaliation. It's in self-defense, which is why the army, when it announced that it was launching this operation that it's calling Operation Iron Wall, it described it as an eye for an eye. And it goes to the heart of this problem. India and Pakistan keep trading counterclaims, and each blames the other for starting this conflict. They see each other as the aggressor. Even yesterday, at a press conference that was held in Army headquarters in Rawalpindi near Islamabad, the Army spokesperson said it isn't their job to de-escalate because they didn't start this, and so the ball is in India's court. Now, of course, India has said that Pakistan is responsible for a blatant escalation. It says that any incursions with drones or missiles are unacceptable, and have accused Pakistan of attempting to violate their sovereignty, and they deny that any of their military infrastructure has been destroyed or damaged in any way. And one of the key points that they keep trading blows on is this accusation about targeting civilian infrastructure. Neither country or army is accepting this, is denying this, is saying that they're only targeting military infrastructure. I think that the issue now is that this has lasted quite a few days now, and it feels like it keeps ramping up. When I was in a market nearby, I was speaking to several residents here, and they're not so much concerned about their safety. The capital, Islamabad, often feels like it's in its own little bubble, but they don't see an off-ramp. They keep saying they don't know how this conflict can end, and one man told me that war is bad for both countries, no matter where you're from or what your religion is.
Meanwhile, Azadeh, Pakistan has been looking for friends on the international stage.
Yes, throughout the week, world leaders have been reaching out to both Pakistan and India as tensions have continued to escalate. Pakistan has also been making its own calls, and as Barasan mentioned there, one of the most significant moments has been when US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called Pakistan and India, and the fact that he's now called both the chief of the army here, General Asim Munir, as well as the foreign minister, is very significant. And that offer to help start constructive talks between the two countries is really important, because if there is any window for de-escalation, it's certainly if these two countries speak to each other.
OK, Azadeh Moshiri for us in Islamabad. Before that, Ambarsan Etirajan in Delhi. Thank you both very much. Right, now the leaders of Britain, France and Germany and Poland have called on Russia to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire in its war in Ukraine. After a virtual meeting of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, the group then called President Trump to update him on their support for the American proposal. The four European leaders, including Sir Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, are in Kiev for talks with President Zelensky, vowing to continue to put that pressure on Russia to build on that proposal first made by President Trump. President Putin has so far not agreed to it. Now, this visit is the first joint visit to Ukraine by these nations since Moscow's invasion more than 3 years ago. Our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman, is travelling with the Prime Minister and sent this report.
This is a visit full of symbolism. Yesterday in Moscow, Vladimir Putin was joined by 20 or so world leaders supportive of Russia. Here is President Zelensky's answer, joined not just by Sir Keir Starmer, but by President Macron of France, the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. But there is more than just symbolism to this. The sign behind me, the Coalition of the Willing, that idea that Sir Keir Starmer has been trying to get off the ground for months now, they will be holding a virtual call. So not just the leaders here today, but also joined by the rest of the 30 or so group of mostly European nations who want to find a way to commit to support Ukraine if a peace deal with Russia can be achieved. Now, what of the prospects for that peace? Well, talking to senior UK government sources, there is a sense that there's just a glimmer of hope that President Trump's position might be hardening towards Russia, that he's growing truly frustrated with President Putin and his approach, that this 30-day ceasefire, which the leaders called for overnight as they arrived here in Ukraine, might actually be a goer. Is that just another false hope, or might it be a practical reality? That's a question that could begin to be answered here today.
Well, Ukraine's foreign minister described the phone call as constructive, said Kiev is ready for a ceasefire of at least 30 days starting on Monday. Our security correspondent Frank Garner is in Kiev. He talked me through the significance of these talks.
Well, I think you've got to separate the symbolism from the fact and the reality. It is very symbolic that a day after Moscow held its big victory parade through Red Square, President Putin showing the world that he's not as isolated as the West would like him to be. He's got the leader of one of the most powerful economies in the world, Xi Jinping, sitting beside him, standing beside him. Meanwhile, over here today, you've got the leaders of four major European countries meeting, shoring up support for Ukraine, making pledges of support, laying wreaths, lighting candles. But what really matters is what President Trump is going to do, because Ukrainians take the view, look, this is great. They appreciate the support. They know that they're going to have to depend more on Europe in the future. But the one thing that's really going to make a difference is if President Trump decides that he has lost patience with Vladimir Putin, that, as he puts it in one of his posts on Truth Social, that he is simply tapping him along, i.e. stringing him along, and follows through on his threat with secondary sanctions. That would mean sanctioning those countries that buy Russia's oil, China, India, and others. At the same time, I think it's quite likely that President Zelensky will repeat his requests for more long-range weaponry, things like Germany's Taurus missiles system, or long-range artillery system, which it's a rocket system actually, which Friedrich Merz's predecessor, Olaf Scholz, was nervous about supplying. He didn't want to antagonize President Putin. But Friedrich Merz, the new Chancellor of Germany, is much more forward-leaning when it comes to supplying Ukraine with weaponry, and I think it's quite likely that we will see a change in Germany's stance there.
Well, former commander of UK and NATO forces, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, also weighed in on why these talks matter.
I think it's hugely symbolic. We all watched the parade in Moscow yesterday, and apart from President Xi there, Putin was surrounded by some pretty unsavory characters. I think we now look to today where we've got four of the most powerful NATO European military countries actually in Kyiv, showing unity, and I think more importantly, sort of flexing NATO European military muscles, and also stating that they want, or as President Zelensky wants, a 30-day ceasefire immediately. And I think a lot of the work that has gone on in NATO, and we had the meeting in Oslo yesterday of the military leaders, showing that actually Europe is ready to provide a force to police that ceasefire. So I think, the ball is entirely in Moscow's court. And just adding what Frank said about the sanctions, with the oil price globally dropping rapidly at the moment, people like Xi and others can probably buy their cheap oil anyway. And if the oil revenue is cut off to Putin, he will very quickly run out of resources to carry on this fight. So let's hope that people in Moscow are listening and watching, and this might be the impetus. And finally, on President Trump, of course, he is key to this. He said he will slap sanctions on Putin, which will again strangle him. But let's hope we also hear from President Trump today or tomorrow in support of this ceasefire.
Well, let's speak now to former British ambassador to Ukraine, Lee Turner. Mr. Ambassador, good to see you. So a ceasefire by Monday, what do you think?
I think, unfortunately, Rich, that's fantastically optimistic. It would be great if that were to come about. But up to now, we haven't seen any sign that this intense period of US peacemaking, which President Trump's launched in February, has really brought about very much. And really, the way that Trump has gone about trying to bring about peace in between Russia and Ukraine underlines the crucial role of Europe, including the UK, in that, because Trump has made two threats. Right at the beginning, he said no US troops will be involved in enforcing any peace deal. And he also said that the US would walk away if Russia and Ukraine didn't agree, apparently within the 100-day deadline, which he set himself. And it's not quite clear if the US has walked away or not. They certainly haven't been very active in the last couple of weeks. So it's absolutely vital that the Europeans are demonstrating that they can give Ukraine the military and economic support that it needs to prevent Russia winning this war. And it's great to see them there, both for the symbolic importance of that, but also, as Frank Gardner was saying, for the practical importance of ramping up military and economic support to Ukraine.
Well, that talk, that symbolism only goes so far, especially if, as you mentioned, the US isn't there, especially if the practical support doesn't materialize. And we saw at President Putin's parade in Moscow just yesterday, he has plenty of friends on whom he can rely. This coalition of the willing is rather flimsy and empty, isn't it?
Well, I don't agree with either of those comments, really, Rich. First of all, President Putin is a master of trying to depict himself as being strong. We've all seen pictures of him with his kit off, trying to look like a strong leader. And Russia likes to say it's not being influenced by sanctions, which transparently isn't true. The Russian economy is in terrible straits. And Russia wants to show it has a lot of friends. And certainly it was significant that President Xi of China was sitting next to Putin on the stand in Red Square. But at the same time, China has been very chary in its support for Moscow throughout this unprovoked war that Putin launched, really blindsiding the Chinese as far as we can see. And we haven't seen high-profile Chinese military aid to Russia, for example. Russia is desperately seeking aid from North Korea and Iran. They're really short of military help. So I wouldn't say that that's insignificant. And then secondly, the role of Europe. Really, there's three things they need to do. I think one, I mentioned military and economic support to stop Russia winning the war. The second thing is putting pressure on Russia to come to the negotiating table. And clearly, the Europeans are wanting to do that. And it will be, as your other commentators were saying, really important that the US comes to the table on that. Not so much to provide boots on the ground as to provide military support, which Ukraine could really use. And most importantly, these secondary sanctions that President Trump has talked about this. And if the US in particular were to impose secondary sanctions, that would make a big difference, stopping countries buying Russia's oil. But then finally, if I just may quickly, if there is a ceasefire, we all hope that will come about. But experience shows that without strong military guarantees, Russia will simply attack again, as it did after the Minsk agreements of 2015. So someone has to provide that military backup.
Yeah.
And President Trump has said he won't do it. So the Europeans coordinating some kind of intervention is really helpful and important.
OK, Lee Turner, former British ambassador to Ukraine. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. And just a reminder, little update on that story as Sir Keir Starmer, along with the French, German and Polish leaders, are in Kiev with President Zelensky. They've held a phone call with Donald Trump, underscoring their support for this 30-day ceasefire. President Putin has not yet responded to that. Now, here in the UK, police are investigating an attack on a prison officer at Belmarsh Prison, which is reported to have been carried out by the Southport killer Axel Rudakabana, who was jailed for a minimum of 52 years for the murder of 3 young girls in an attack at a dance class last summer. Let's go straight to Aruna Iyengar, our correspondent outside the Ministry of Justice. Aruna, this came to us through newspaper reports. Details are a bit scant. What do we know?
Yes, well, the prison service today is saying that it will take the sharpest possible punishments against those who attack what it calls its hard-working prison officers. What this report in the Sun newspaper says is that allegedly Axel Rudakabana managed to boil water and throw it over a prison officer at Belmarsh Prison last Thursday. Now, the prison officer was taken to hospital and discharged later on in the day and is due back at work next week. So all's well so far. But this raises the question about safety for prison officers. Axel Rudakabana, if you remember, was sentenced last January to 50 years minimum term for the murder of 3 young girls in Southport at a Taylor Swift themed dance workshop. He was also found guilty of attempting to murder 10 other people. So this comes as we've seen a recent spate of attacks on prison officers. Back in April, there was an attack by Hashem Abedi, the brother of the Manchester Arena bomber who helped in that bomb attack. He managed to boil oil and throw it over 4 prison officers at a prison in County Durham. So there's questions now being asked about the safety of officers. Shabina Mahmood, the Justice Minister, has said that she will conduct a review into the safety for prison officers. And there's also the question of whether tasers will be used in prisons as a trial procedure over the coming months.
OK, Aruna Iyengar for us outside the Ministry of Justice in London. Aruna, thank you very much. Now, part of a Soviet spacecraft is expected to crash back down to Earth today, but experts aren't exactly sure where it will land. Cosmos was launched in 1972, initially headed for Venus, but it failed to escape Earth's orbit. Palab Ghosh has this report.
Cosmos 482, similar to this spacecraft, failed to escape low Earth orbit and broke into 4 pieces shortly after launch. And it's only now that one of these fragments, most probably the lander, will re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Spacecraft do this almost on a daily basis and usually burn up on re-entry. But the Soviet-built probe was designed to survive the descent into Venus's harsh acidic atmosphere, so there's a chance that some of it could remain intact and land on Earth.
It was designed to survive re-entry, so we can be pretty sure that there's going to be at least one fragment surviving of it. And because of its peculiar orbit in which it is, and because it's a nice intact object, it's also an opportunity for scientists to study the behavior and the re-entry of this kind of objects.
This means it could potentially land anywhere from as far north as London to as far south as the southern tip of South America. But the chances of it impacting on a populated area are tiny. 70% of the Earth is covered by sea, and most of the landmass is sparsely populated. Palab Ghosh, BBC News.
Now let's remind you of our top story this hour. Pakistan says it's retaliating after accusing India of striking 3 Pakistani air bases overnight, including one near the capital, Islamabad. Both countries blame each other for the violence, which has flared up since militants killed Indian tourists last month in Indian-administered Kashmir. India accuses Pakistan of being involved, an accusation Pakistan denies. And I just want to bring you these pictures from Geneva at the moment, where Chinese and American delegates have been meeting to discuss trade. Now, when President Trump came to the White House and started applying tariffs to some of the US's biggest trade partners, he initially hit Chinese imports with 145% tariffs. These talks are looking at changing that situation. President Trump's already proposed cutting some of those tariffs. Just the other day, he wrote on his social media site, Truth Social, that 80% tariffs sound about right. We earlier saw footage of some of the delegates leaving the venue of these trade talks. On Friday, official figures for April show that China's exports to the US fell by more than 20% compared to a year earlier. Of course, President Trump's tariffs have hit many of America's trade partners, so we'll continue to follow the latest on these trade talks. Don't go anywhere. I'll be back in a few moments' time. Stick with us here on BBC News. Bye-bye for now. Hello, this is BBC News, the latest headlines. India has condemned attacks by Pakistan as cowardly and deplorable, saying they targeted Indian civilian infrastructure. India's military said Islamabad had escalated its assaults, including mass drone strikes along its western border. It comes after Indian strikes on Pakistan over the disputed region of Kashmir. At least 50 people have been killed since the fighting escalated on Wednesday. It comes after last month's militant killing of 26 tourists in Indian-administered Kashmir. And in other news, Sir Keir Starmer and President Macron are among leaders in Ukraine meeting President Zelensky as calls grow for Russia to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. The leaders have vowed to continue putting pressure on Vladimir Putin to build on the proposal put forward by President Trump.
Now on BBC News, veteran World Affairs editor John Simpson talks to BBC correspondents, going beyond the headlines for expert analysis of the week's major international news stories. Unspun World.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Unspun World. What are Vladimir Putin's tactics now as the Ukraine war grinds on?
For him, war is a way of life, and that's why I think he's brought Russia to the point where war is the only state in which his administration can exist.
Meanwhile, Poland's getting ready for the possibility that it could be next to be invaded.
Poland is the gatekeeper. This is the eastern flank of NATO. Poland would have to withstand the first wave of any Russian attack.
And although the world's focused on Gaza, life in the other Palestinian territory, the West Bank, can be equally precarious.
Now those camps have become totally uninhabitable, unlivable, because there's been such a damage done to the infrastructure of these camps.
War can be contagious, as India and Pakistan's latest confrontation shows. What is unthinkable and dangerous at one moment suddenly becomes more acceptable if other countries are doing the same thing. Depending on how you count them, there are at least 32 conflicts going on around the world at the moment, though the one in Ukraine is the most intense and the most dangerous. Donald Trump thought he could sort that out within 24 hours of becoming president. Instead, it's still dragging on 3 months later with no sign of a long-lasting ceasefire.
Good to see you.
Former President Joe Biden accuses President Trump of appeasing Russia. Yet the truth is, it's hard to work out what Mr. Trump is doing. Sometimes he seems to be leaning towards Vladimir Putin and sometimes towards President Zelensky of Ukraine. But how is the war itself going? Vitaly Shevchenko is Russia editor of BBC Monitoring.
People are still dying on the ground, day in, day out, night in, night out. If anything, the number and intensity of Russian attacks, which result in huge numbers of civilian deaths, that's increased. So that's not really a message of peace that we're hearing from Moscow. What we're hearing from Washington is an increasing tone of disappointment, irritation, annoyance, mostly with Vladimir Zelensky, but also there are undertones of Donald Trump and his officials sounding mildly irritated with Vladimir Putin and saying, well, he may not actually be seeking peace after all. The big question is, what is Washington going to do about it? And it seems that Washington isn't really willing or able to put much pressure on Vladimir Putin, enough pressure to make him stop.
Is it that Putin realizes he doesn't need to have a ceasefire?
I don't think he ever thought he needed a ceasefire. We've heard statements made by officials from Donald Trump down that Ukraine must accept that it's not getting back Crimea, possibly parts or maybe all of the other 4 regions. Of course, this is hardly likely to make Vladimir Putin stop and rethink his strategy. For Ukraine, choices are really limited. Rhetoric coming out of Kiev shows that officials in Ukraine are really worried that they will lose Washington as an ally. Maybe they have, but the repeated thank yous voiced by Vladimir Zelensky and all the others, and mentions of Donald Trump's great leadership, clearly they are designed to appeal to his ego and make him stay on Ukraine's side. And so is the minerals deal.
Do you think that Putin would need the war to end? Or do you think that he benefits from carrying it on?
For him, war is a way of life. And that's why I think he's brought Russia to the point where war is the only state in which his administration can exist. If it suddenly ends, there'd be no point. Go back to milk, steel, roads, hospitals. That's boring. I'm all about war and restoring greatness. And for him, greatness is expanding territory, restoring the Soviet Union in some shape or form, Russian Empire maybe. That's why I don't think he will stop unless he's made to stop.
And Ukraine, I mean, it can't carry on fighting indefinitely, can it?
No, but what choice does it have? I've heard many Ukrainians say, we've had enough. On the other hand, these Ukrainians know what happens if Russia comes. That's the end of Ukrainian culture, language, history. Looking at what Russia's been doing in occupied parts of Ukraine is terrifying. I'll give you one example. There's a group called Yunarmia, which literally translates the youth army, and it has been involving young Ukrainians from the age of 8 in paramilitary activities, weapons handling, battlefield tactics, propaganda, how Russia is great and how Ukraine doesn't really exist in a state. So, if Russia comes and stays, that's the end of Ukraine there.
Finally, Vitaly, do you have any sense how this is going to play out in the end?
This year, more than 20 heads of state or government are coming to Moscow to attend its victory parade. And that, I think, is a sign of Vladimir Putin breaking out of isolation. Right now, the people who are going to Moscow to attend that parade are obviously thinking, oh, it's okay to deal with Russia again. That is a bad sign for Ukraine, good sign for Vladimir Putin, and it's a sign of things not really going in Ukraine's favor.
NATO has often been accused of trying to encircle Russia. It's a point Russia's redoubtable foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, often makes. The fact is, though, that every one of the former Soviet bloc countries, which has joined NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union, has done so because it's frightened that Russia might come back and attack it, just as it's attacked Ukraine. This is particularly true of the Baltic countries and of Poland, which are all spending money heavily on defence and are showing distinct signs of nervousness about whether President Trump will come to their aid if Russia were to attack. Poland is leading the way in defence spending, as Will Vernon, the BBC correspondent in Warsaw, explained to me.
Poland is in an incredibly, well, some people call it strategic, some people call it vulnerable geographical location, right? It's got a long border with Ukraine. It's also got a border with Russia, right? In the north, the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, sandwiched between Lithuania, Poland, and the Baltic Sea. Russia says that it has nuclear weapons there. But Poland also borders Belarus, right? Russia's close ally. So Polish officials love to tell the West that Poland is the gatekeeper. This is the eastern flank of NATO, that Poland would have to withstand the first wave of any Russian attack. And so, yeah, when you speak to people here, it is all about Russia. I just recently visited a training program for civilians, the Saturday morning training program where ordinary Polish men and women can go and learn basic military skills like putting on a gas mask or first aid or shooting a rifle, that kind of thing.
And of course, the Poles have been leading the charge, really, in the whole business of paying more for their defence.
That's right. Poland this year is on course to spend almost 5% of GDP on defence. That's by far the largest in NATO. But the plan is, according to Prime Minister Donald Tusk, to increase that even further. And also, any day now, Poland's due to sign a security pact with France, and there's another one in the pipeline with the UK as well, both of those sitting outside of NATO, because ever since Donald Trump returned to the White House, there have been several moments that he and his administration have done that have caused a lot of concern and cast doubt on the future of NATO. The US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he was here in Warsaw earlier this year, and he stood here in Warsaw. I was in the room. There was a bit of a ripple of unease, really, that passed through everyone when Mr. Hegseth stood there and said that Europe mustn't assume that the American troop presence on the continent will last forever.
Is it too cynical to think that some of this, at any rate, might be linked to the presidential elections later this month?
This conversation about Polish security, about beefing up the armed forces, strengthening the borders, that all is very much a hot button topic in this election. Of course, none of the front runners have said they are against those reforms because expanding the military here enjoys huge support amongst ordinary Poles, but there are disagreements over Polish support specifically for Ukraine and for Ukrainian refugees living in Poland. And Donald Tusk's party have accused the other opposition candidates of basically repeating Kremlin talking points, saying that Ukrainian refugees are a drain on society, or that they're dangerous, or they don't respect Poland. Another big topic in this presidential election campaign has been whether Poland should commit forces to any European peacekeeping force or reassurance force, or whatever you want to call it, that has been discussed recently, hasn't it, in the context of any possible peace deal in Ukraine. And Donald Tusk and the Polish government have said they will not commit Polish troops to that mission. And that came as a bit of a surprise to many in Europe.
And I suppose there must be an argument that if Polish troops were in Ukraine, got into some sort of fight with the Russians, then what everybody's afraid of, some sort of Russian response across the border, might actually take shape.
The position of the Polish government is that, while we support Ukraine and we support the efforts by Britain, France and other Western allies to, put together some sort of plan for a force to go into Ukraine in the event of a peace deal, at the same time they say Polish troops need to be here. Polish troops need to protect Poland.
It's been 9 weeks since food aid and medicine was last allowed into Gaza. Now Israel's fiery finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who's an ally of Prime Minister Netanyahu, says Gaza will be entirely destroyed and its people will have to leave in large numbers to go to other countries. But while the world's attention has been focused on Gaza, the Palestinian territories on the West Bank have also been under attack, though on a lesser scale. In January, Israel's forces carried out big operations in 3 West Bank refugee camps. According to the UN, 40,000 people have been displaced there, and several hundred homes have been demolished for what are called military reasons. A reporter for the BBC World Service, Emir Nada, has been following the case of a Palestinian in his 60s from Jenin, whose house was one of those destroyed.
Well, Jumar is a 66-year-old man, a father of 9. He grew up in Jenin refugee camp, which is part of Jenin city. Now, because of the Israel security operations there against armed groups in the refugee camp, he, like 20,000 other Palestinians from the refugee camp, been forced to leave there, and they haven't really been allowed back except for very brief moments to grab what they can. He's now living in temporary accommodation. His family are all dispersed, and he is really unsure about what happens next. Will he ever be allowed back?
And why was he a target for the Israelis, do you think?
Well, he wasn't necessarily a direct target. He is a builder, a former builder. He has no links to militancy. However, those refugee camps across the West Bank, where tens of thousands of Palestinians moved to, have become the centres of militancy, protest, or indeed armed groups who have, as they put it, fought Israeli occupation. The Israeli military and the Israeli government, for their part, call them terrorists. The Ministry of Defence says they don't want the armed groups to return, and so that's why they are blockading them, demolishing some structures that they say are part of terror infrastructure. The mayor of Jenin told us that now those camps have become totally uninhabitable, unlivable, because there's been such a damage done to the infrastructure of these camps.
And are Israeli settlers involved in this in any way?
There have been attacks by these armed groups on some of the settlers. The picture with the settlers perhaps speaks to the wider situation in the West Bank.